Hello everyone, excited to be back with another fashion deep dive, and I'm very excited for this one because this is a designer that has a very special place in my heart, and I didn't actually know that much about her when I started looking into this video, but after researching Marc Jacobs and Anna Sui and so many others, I realized that she has always been involved, she has always been inspiring people, and she has always been here. She's someone who has been rocking and dismantling the fashion industry with her designs since the 60s, known for her exuberant embellishments and her over-the-top commitment to remaining true to her vision. She is unapologetic, known for her cartwheels, splits, and crazy hair. Today we are talking about the wacky and extraordinary Betsey Johnson. Recipient of the Council of Fashion Designers of America Timeless Talent Award, which was created just for her by the CFDA, as well as the National Arts Club Medal of Honor for Lifetime Achievement in Fashion. She has been contributing to the fashion industry for decades, but has long been shamed and ignored by many in the fashion world who do not see her as a fashion designer. The news often wrote about how Betsey Johnson angered the press because she wasn't necessarily a Vogue girl, and there weren't interviews or profiles done on her, but women love Betsey Johnson, and that's who made her famous. Today we will be talking about the talent that she is, as well as the method to her madness. But in order to talk about the wonder that Betsey Johnson is, we must first start at the beginning, the very beginning. So let's do this. Betsey Lee Johnson was born August 10th, 1942 in Wethersfield, Connecticut, a suburb of Hartford. So if you watched Gilmore Girls, you know all about Hartford, and Wethersfield was not much different. A very small, tight-knit community with neighborhood vegetable gardens, a place where everyone knew everyone. And with her bubbly, oddball personality, Betsey Johnson definitely stuck out. Being a Leo and having her sun and moon in Leo as well, her energy and enthusiasm for life was just too bright for such a small town. Her parents, Lena and John, were an idyllic couple and your typical old-school fashion family from the suburbs of Connecticut. John trained as an electrical engineer and worked in a metal foundry, while Lena was a stay-at-home mom who was very involved. She became the den mother of her son's Cub Scouts and troop leader of her daughter's Girl Scout troops. As well, she was head of the PTA and later the guidance counselor at their school. The Johnsons were the postcard picture of an American family living in the suburbs. They ate breakfast together every morning and sat down for dinner at 6 p.m. every evening, no matter what. And as far as Betsey remembers, her parents never fought. Her older sister Sally and her younger brother Robert were pragmatic. While they studied and did their homework after school, Betsey would spend her time walking on her hands, swaying in the air, trying to keep her balance, working on perfecting her handstands. She has always had a peculiar drive, but her bubbly personality harbored some deep-seated emotions. As a child who grew up during World War II, Betsey remembers the dread that followed her throughout childhood, listening to the war reports on the radio and seeing the photos in the newspaper. The uncertain times filled her with insecurity and fear, feelings she didn't know how to articulate as a young child. And the news and the media did a great job in making it seem like the threat of war and bombings laid around every corner. But Betsey's small town in Connecticut was never truly in any danger. However, that didn't stop everyone from living with this fear of uncertainty. And actually, Betsey's father, John, was what they called a blackout man, who was responsible for going around the neighborhood at night to make sure that everyone had their blackout shades down after sunset, a preventative measure that made sure that their town was invisible from above. And Betsey just found it creepy and omniscient how her father would walk around in total darkness, making sure the town was cloaked. And while her early life was cloaked in darkness, Betsey has chosen to live in the light, in happiness, and in sunshine. She wanted a life full of adventure, and her parents more than encouraged their children to be involved in everything and anything. There truly was no limit. Her younger brother Robert was your typical happy brother, the fastest guy on the basketball team who had a wicked sharp eye for darts. While her older sister Sally was perfect, president of her class, a lifeguard at their local pool, and a volunteer at the Red Cross. And in true younger sister fashion, Betsey wanted to do everything Sally did. She truly idolized her, but she would get frustrated that she wasn't as good as Sally, always failing to keep up with her, which led to animosity and competition as children. Again, just typical sibling behavior. But the siblings were always busy with Cub Scouts, Girl Scouts, baseball, basketball, dance classes, swimming. Their parents encouraged and supported them however they could, but they were strict. None of the children were allowed to bring home anything less than a B, which was tough on Betsy, who didn't have the ability to sit through math and science classes. So she had to work harder than her classmates just to get the same grades. But this didn't deter her, and despite having to work harder and study longer, she was able to keep up her grades while being involved in all kinds of activities, including dance and cheerleading, and she even had time for boys. During her high school years, Betsy and her friends were boy crazy, falling in love with all of the football players. But boys were not her whole life. Dancing was her main focus, something she loved since childhood. She danced throughout her life, in her room, in the living room, the kitchen, on the street, on her way home from school. She danced everywhere. She even put on recitals in her backyard, and her dad would actually lay down sheets of plywood to make a makeshift stage, and all of the kids in the neighborhood would come and watch her performances. Despite being an anxious child, dance allowed her to expel her worries. Nothing could touch her when she was dancing. And at 4 years old, she was put in dance classes at the Ann K. Pym School of Dance. And Ann Pym was a professional dancer on Broadway, beautiful, glamorous, and an amazing dancer. She taught ballet, tap, jazz, and gymnastics, and Betsy quickly fell under her spell. As a natural acrobat, she picked up somersaults, backflips, and cartwheels with ease. Ann would wear black leotards with starched white skirts, and Betsy long admired these outfits and really wanted to emulate her. Ann Pym would go on to be a very strong influence on Betsy's tutu and leotard style. But besides being a strong fashion influence, Ann Pym cultivated Betsy's young interest. She was known for taking students on field trips, and on one field trip, Betsy was taken to the Radio City Music Hall in New York to see the Rockettes' Christmas special. And she remembers being completely mesmerized. And it was that day she began to dream of moving to New York and becoming a Rockette. Dance consumed her life, with Betsy saying, "It consumed 95% of my body and 95% of my head." And every day she went to dance classes until she was 14 years old, when the family moved and Betsy decided to start her own dance school. Now, one of Ann Pym's older students had actually opened up a studio a few years prior in a different town, but then she had gotten married and pregnant, so running a dance studio wasn't in the cards for her. So she asked Betsy to take over the business, and that is how the Betsey Johnson School of Dance was born. She taught on the weekends, between school and cheerleading. She worked 7 days a week, but it never fazed her. She never faltered. She even was able to be on her high school's prom committee, and she won prom queen, accepting the award in a heavy off-white satin floor-length skirt with a bodice covered in rhinestones and little crystal droplets, with her hair dyed red. And all I'm wondering is, like, does everyone dye their hair red at some point? Because I've never dyed my whole head, but I did dye the ends red, and I did dye them red for prom, so I just find it funny. I just find it really funny. Regardless, after high school, Betsy knew that she wanted to go to school in New York, and she wanted to attend for an arts-related major, so she compiled a portfolio of her illustrative work and applied to Pratt University, which she got into. In 1960, Betsy attended Pratt University in Brooklyn, New York, and she was so excited. She started her art classes, and she had even joined the cheerleading team. But her excitement quickly turned to disillusionment, as she had a difficult time making friends with the other art students, who actually started making fun of her for being a cheerleader. I guess cheerleading didn't fit into their preconceived notion of artistic behavior, with Betsy saying, "I made the cheerleading squad, and that was like the ugliest, the worst, most embarrassing thing you could be as an art student." She felt that all of them were full of themselves and wildly pretentious. All she wanted to do was be creative and make art and cheer on the side, while everyone else thought themselves the next Picasso. But it wasn't just Pratt University that didn't work out for her. Between her classes and the workload, Betsy didn't have time to see her family, hang out with friends, or even devote time to dancing. And very soon after, she realized her dreams of being a Rockette were shattered when she learned there was a height requirement and she was too short. She would never be a Rockette, and so she had to shift focus. Her first semester at Pratt was nothing like she thought it would be. Despite having good grades and her teachers liking her, she hated it. She hated the taunts from the art students about being a cheerleader. She hated the heavy workload. She was overextending herself, working herself ragged, and it wasn't enough. She had begun stress eating and ended up putting on a lot of weight, so much so that she didn't recognize herself and she didn't feel like herself either. So by Christmas break, she had actually made the decision to leave Pratt at the end of the year. Her parents supported this decision and they even helped her apply to Syracuse University, which was much closer to home so she could visit. They even had a cheerleading team and a football team, and it was the perfect fit. The school was so big that she could get lost in the crowd, and that meant she could take her art classes and also be a cheerleader, and no one was going to taunt her. And it was there at Syracuse that Betsy began studying fabric design, an extension of her illustration classes, and it was in these classes she learned how to create repeated patterns, which would become pivotal to her later career. But this wasn't the first time that Betsy was actually introduced to fashion. Her mother, to be sociable, learned how to sew clothes for the children, as it was cheaper than buying clothes at the store. So she made them plaid dresses with puff sleeves, sashes, and bows. She even made Betsy's dance uniforms with layers of tulle and sequins. And when Betsy was old enough, she actually began helping her mother out. But this wasn't some epiphany moment for her. Betsy never derived pleasure from cutting or sewing, and she had no idea that this was going to become her career. But in later years, she said that these moments will always be my biggest inspiration, along with old Hollywood movies. It was only at Syracuse that she felt encouraged to try new things and was given absolute freedom to experiment without anyone questioning her methods. 10 years after her graduation in 1975, she was presented the George Arendt Award from Syracuse, and to commemorate the award, 2 dorms were redecorated in her famous Betsey Johnson prints. One room was floral, the other was aquamarine and turquoise. A very cool concept that I think today would be annoying, but in the 70s had to be an absolute hit. Plus, by the 70s, Betsey Johnson had made a name for herself, and it was at Syracuse that she blossomed, where she excelled, and where everything started for her. By fate or coincidence, who knows, it was her time at Syracuse that made her feel capable of doing anything. An avid reader of the infamous Mademoiselle magazine, she read about a contest they were hosting to celebrate the best that young America had to offer. The contest was open to college girls in fashion, art, and writing, and the winners would spend a month in New York as guest editors for the August college issue of Mademoiselle. And they would be treated to a week's travel in a foreign country as youth ambassadors. A very prestigious award with winners including Sylvia Plath, Joan Didion, and Candice Bergen. The contest sounded like the answer to her prayers on what to do after college, as she really didn't know what she wanted to do, but she knew that she needed to get back to New York, and this contest was her opportunity. She loved New York, she loved its competitive nature, the craziness. Everything seemed to be happening in New York, and Betsy knew that she needed to find her way back there. So she applied, and within a week she received a letter informing her that she was in the running for the contest. Qualified applicants were asked to complete monthly assignments, and for months, that's all Betsy focused her attention on. She wasn't interested in fashion, she was focused on art, but she knew how to cut, sew, and create patterns, which were useful skills that helped her in the competition. And right before graduation in May 1964, she received a telegram informing her that out of thousands of applicants, Betsy was one of 20 girls selected to participate. Her start date was before her graduation, but she was more than happy to miss it if it meant getting back to New York. She really felt ready to move on and up in the world. Upon her arrival, she found herself placed in the fabric department, where readers learned about new textiles and they got their free patterns. And despite being in New York and winning the contest, Betsy was bummed. She didn't want to be in the fabric department, but it was literally the best thing to happen to her. It's where she met her editor, DJ White, and Edie Locke, who would influence Betsy to think outside the box and also help further her career. And it's worth mentioning here that DJ White was very pregnant at this time, and this will be important information soon. So as part of the contest, the girls were taken on a week-long international trip, and Betsy's group actually went to London during a very pivotal and very inspiring time. Mary Quant was thriving, bell-bottoms were in, London was the most exciting place to be, and during their week-long stay, the girls worked from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., and then they would sneak out every night to hit up the clubs where they danced the night away. That week, she only slept like 2 hours in total, trying to take in everything London had to offer. And it was truly the beginning of everything. After the trip back to New York, DJ White, Betsy's departmental editor left for maternity leave, so Edie Locke stepped up and helped Betsy finish the issue. After it was done, Edie was so impressed by how fast Betsy had gotten on in the office that she offered her the job filling in for DJ White while she was on maternity leave. And Betsy agreed, and now she was a full-time employee and member of the arts department, answering phones, routing photostats between departments, and viewing portfolios from artists and photographers, basically doing anything asked of her. On the experience, Betsy said that was the turning point. That was the huge foot-in-the-door gig. I could draw ugly things and make them look good. It was an absolute turning point in her life. She was growing up, and she had found her first apartment, a fifth-floor walk-up under the Brooklyn Bridge. And because rent was cheap and money was tight, Betsy went back to making her own clothes, like a tank dress with a scoop neck or an A-line shift dress, dresses with few seams, no darts or embellishments. She had even gotten a crocheted knit fabric and turned it into a sweater with short tight sleeves and a scoop neck trimmed with half an inch of velvet and finished with a bow. She wore these pieces to work every day, and over time, she actually began selling them to other girls in the office because they loved them so much. And this is pretty much how her business took off. The higher-ups actually began taking notice, and they asked Betsy if they could shoot some of her work for the magazine. And of course she said yes. And from there, orders started flying in. And she had a very hard time keeping up. She was making them by hand, one at a time, every day after work. So she would go to work, and then she would go home and work until 1 a.m. cutting and sewing. Every week she was creating around 30 sweaters by hand. Despite the stress, she loved it. And she loved that she had discovered what she wanted to do with her life. With Betsy saying, "I didn't know what I was doing or where it was going, but something was happening." One of her first orders came from actress Kim Novak, and Betsy was so grateful. She included a handwritten letter to Novak, who responded with an order for 2 more sweaters. And this is why the Betsey Johnson hang tags always included a printed note on them, an ode to this moment in her life. But sadly, after 9 months, Betsy's time at Mademoiselle was over, and Edie Locke was about to help her out big time. Edie had learned that Puritan Fashions, a huge fashion manufacturer, was backing a new store in New York called Paraphernalia, a boutique concept started by Paul Young in London that gave space to up-and-coming designers like Mary Quant, Emmanuel Khan, and Paco Rabanne. The store catered to young rich girls. It was very popular in London, so Young was convinced to try out the concept in New York and cater to the young rich society girls, bringing downtown dress uptown. It was for the girls, the gays, the theys, and the boys, as long as they were skinny enough and didn't mind that their buttons and flies were like on the opposite side. Anyway, Paul Young had reached out to Edie Locke for a list of interesting new designers, and she immediately put Betsy's name on the list, setting her up with a meeting with Paul Young. And it all happened so fast that Betsy only had 2 days to put together an entire portfolio before her interview, and she didn't even know where to begin. She was still fulfilling orders, staying up all night, and barely sleeping. She was stretched so thin that she had no time to prepare. So she decided to contact all the girls at Mademoiselle who had bought something from her, asked to borrow the pieces, and they more than happily agreed. So she had 2 suitcases full of pieces for her interview, and she spent the weekend redrawing her sketches in crayon the way she always has. On the day of the meeting, she arrived to find Paul Young sketching with colored crayons as well, and immediately felt a connection. He must have felt a connection too, because he offered her a job that day. And from that day, she would have 3 months until Paraphernalia opened to have made and delivered her work. She was responsible for the designs and expected to produce the first samples. Then the Paraphernalia team would produce them, decide quantity, and organize delivery. The tags would read "Designed by Betsey Johnson for Paraphernalia," and this was huge for anyone. Most people work their entire lives and never get their own name on a label. And she was truly blessed. Paraphernalia was an absolute dream. How it was set up was that the store would stock designs from Betsey Johnson and 4 other designers. Each were given their own workroom and a pattern maker. 8 hours a day she worked in the workroom, and then she would continue making patterns at home. At this time, she was very hard on money because she was young. She had to pay for her samples out of her own pocket until Paraphernalia reimbursed her. So DJ White at Mademoiselle actually helped her source cheap fabrics, and that is how Betsy was able to actually afford to make her samples and send them off to the factory. And it all seemed to work out until 3 days before the store opening, when Paul Young called her up and told her that something had happened at the factory and her designs wouldn't be ready in time for the store opening. and it was like a punch to the stomach. Paul Young told her that if she could make up some pieces, he would be more than happy to put them in the shop until her designs were ready. And she really didn't have much of a choice. Opening night was set to be a huge affair. Andy Warhol had planned the opening, and he had hired the Velvet Underground to perform. Her name was going to be shown to all of New York's fashion elite, so she had to make something up. And she would. She wasn't entirely proud of the work that she had put out, but it was something. On September 16, 1965, Paraphernalia opened, and Betsy was bummed. She didn't want to be around all the famous models and people that were going to be there. She didn't feel like she belonged, but she went anyway. Andy Warhol was in attendance, the Velvet Underground performed, Patty Boyd, Marissa Berenson, and Jean Shrimpton were hired to model, while go-go dancers shimmied in the window. Despite all the chaos and happenings in the store, Betsy sulked around, and then she went home, disappointed and depressed. She put herself to bed, got up the next day, and went back to work. Her clothing dilemma would eventually be fixed, and thank God, because this is truly some of her most iconic work. An unrestricted time period that gave her a no-holds-barred chance to create anything and everything she dreamed of. She could create the things she wanted to wear and what she felt was fun, like the silverfish dress, which was made of silver lame fishnet, that Karen Black actually wore in the movie Easy Rider months later. She also created a dress called The Story of O, a faux suede A-line dress with strategically placed brass grommets sewed into it. And she even made the Julie Christie dress, a basic shirt dress design with a starched collar and cuffs. And the dress was actually called Julie Christie because it was made famous by Julie Christie, who wore the dress on the cover of Mademoiselle after winning an Oscar for her role in the film Darling.
I also love Julie Christie.
Wasn't she the first to wear one of your pieces?
It was named the Julie Christie dress. She was the ultimate girl to me.
Paraphernalia attracted customers like Julie Christie, Twiggy, and Edie Sedgwick. And actually, Sedgwick was introduced to Betsy by Andy Warhol, and that's how she became her fitting model, and how Betsy's designs ended up in her film Ciao Manhattan. Her work at Paraphernalia made her famous. There's even an article from 1966 in the New York Times with a quote about Betsy that says, "Miss Johnson, who at 23 is better known to the young than Balenciaga." And it was true. Paraphernalia couldn't keep her items on the rack. Production was constantly calling her up asking for more samples because they could never keep her in stock. She worked every day, drawing up samples, putting out samples every week. And unlike most stores and designers, Paraphernalia was a wear now type store. Their slogan was, "You go to Paraphernalia for clothes to wear out on Saturday night and throw out on Sunday morning." Rock bands, artists, hip downtown kids, and their uptown wannabe counterparts shop there. And while she outsold the other designers, she didn't actually make a lot of money at Paraphernalia because she refused to sell anything for more than $100, which was enough money she equated to the cost of a weekend trip to Puerto Rico, which at 23 years old was enough for her. She didn't need to make thousands. She just wanted a nice vacation every once in a while.
To me, it was more than a round trip ticket to Puerto Rico. And this is truly what I believe. Puerto Rico round trip, 2 nights in a hotel, plus airfare, $99. So I said, I don't want my clothes to ever be more than that round trip ticket to Puerto Rico. Because a dress is not that important. I mean, I'd rather go to Puerto Rico for the weekend.
With the money she made, she was able to go out and live. And she truly did live through an incredible time in New York City history.
We were the only new kids on the block. And I didn't know that, but at the time, nobody knew it. Everyone's like, oh, we think we're so far out. We were poor little kids. No money, just loving our work. We all hung out at Max's Kansas City because we needed to be together. Blondie was a waitress. Julian Schnabel was a busboy. And we were all kids. We were all 22, 23. Bob Dylan, I remember, sitting in the booth with Viva. She was my best friend. They just loved my clothes and I did their clothes. Those years, those 60s years were it. Nothing will hold a candle ever to the 60s. We went from nowhere to everywhere, from nothing creative to an explosion of creativity.
Paraphernalia became the hangout for the Velvet Underground after they played opening night, but Betsy wouldn't actually meet them until she saw them perform at Max's Kansas City. And that's when she started dating lead guitarist Sterling Morrison. By 1966, Betsy had started making clothes for the members of the band, except Nico, who liked to make her own clothes. Betsy loved everything about this time. The whole scene of sleeping all day, party after party, dressed in the craziest outfits from plastic dresses to paper dresses to electric dresses. Nothing seemed impossible in the 60s. By April 1966, Betsy was a part of New York's scene. She even attended the Velvet Underground's show produced by Andy Warhol called Andy Warhol Presents the Exploding Plastic Inevitable. And it was that night that Betsy became intrigued by John Cale. Forget Sterling Morrison, John Cale was more interesting. He made her laugh, and she loved how his brain worked, how he seemed to know everything, and she loved listening to him. To her, he was a poet, so she designed clothes for him to fit the part. They were crazy for each other, and Cale liked how she was always happy and made him feel comfortable. They quickly moved in together, and almost immediately Betsy became a stabilizing factor in his life. And it wasn't long before they decided to get married. Unsure of really how it happened, they ran with it and got married at City Hall in 1968. Betsy was 26 years old, and originally she had planned to get married in a burgundy crushed velvet Edwardian style pantsuit with a white silk blouse and a bow at the neck. She even made John a matching suit in black, but right before they were about to get married, the judge told her that he wouldn't marry a girl wearing pants. And this was a very different time period. Women didn't really wear pants, they didn't wear them out in public, so to get married in pants was preposterous, outrageous. And a distraught Betsy did not want to go home to change and then come back. So she ran to the bathroom, took off her pants, pulled down her jacket as far as it would go, which wasn't very far, and then she walked back into that courtroom and jaws hit the floor. Betsy turned to the judge and said, "Okay, Your Honor, I'm not wearing pants. Will you marry us now?" And he did.
But what do you remember about the look? What were you saying about the pants?
John Cale
Yeah.
of the Velvet Underground and I got married in 1966. We went to City Hall. I was wearing a beautiful burgundy crushed velvet tunic top and bell-bottom pants, and John was wearing a black canvas suit I made for him. We went to City Hall to go get married. All of a sudden, they're saying, "We can't marry you in pants." Can you believe that? I mean, and the rule was you could not do anything in pants. You couldn't go to a restaurant in pants, uptown. You couldn't get married in pants. So what was really funny was I was wearing a crotch length little tunic top. So right in front of the judge, I said, "I'm not going to go home to change. I'll just take my pants off." So I got married in this tiny, tiny little velvet tunic. But anyway.
Those in attendance included Andy Warhol, Sterling Morrison, Nico, and some other models. Her parents actually weren't in attendance, as they had only met John a few times prior, and they really didn't think that she should marry him. But I did watch this video, and it did say that her mom ended up going to the party after, so maybe she just didn't make the courthouse.
And after we got married, we walked down the street maybe and went to a deli and had breakfast. There was no ceremony, no nothing.
There was paparazzi shots of Andy Warhol.
Right, I did have a party in my loft, and my mother was there, and it's so funny to see my mom with Andy. But Andy came, and the Velvets, Andy Warhol came, and Lou Reed, and Mo, and Sterling, and John. So it was a small gathering.
But Betsy didn't take it too hard. She didn't really take the marriage too seriously either. For a good minute, she did have it in her head that they were going to have this normal marriage, one where she would make a pot roast every Sunday like her mother did. And for a while, John agreed. He too wanted the pipe and slippers kind of home life, but their differences quickly became obvious as she was a day person who kept a very tight schedule, and he was a night owl who didn't keep regular hours. But the biggest contention was that Cale was battling a drug addiction, and while Betsy found it tolerable at first, viewing it through the lens of a tortured artist, she quickly became frightened by his usage. Cale never came outright to her about his drug use, but she knew. A woman always knows. Soon after, the band released their song Heroin, which featured the line, "Heroin, it's my life, it's my wife." And Betsy felt that that line pretty much summed up their marriage. She would go to work every day, never knowing if he would be alive when she got home. The stress and uncertainty weighed on her, and she really tried to bring some normalcy to their lives, but he was unreceptive. By their first anniversary, they were barely speaking. Betsy had thrown herself into work, ignoring everything, because she had no idea how to fix their marriage. She was 27 years old, and everything was falling apart, within her marriage and outside of it as well. Lou Reed, lead singer of the Velvet Underground, felt Betsey Johnson was becoming the Yoko Ono of their group by trying to come between Lou's relationship with John. And Betsy said Lou always seemed to be a little in love with John and hated when his attention wasn't 100% on the band. So he began giving her dirty looks, making her feel uncomfortable, and dismissing her as that girl who makes the clothes. Despite her making clothes for their performances, he never had a nice thing to say about her. Eventually, Lou called the band together and gave them an ultimatum. Either John goes or I do. And with that, John Cale was kicked out of the Velvet Underground. Lou Reed claims that he wanted commercial success, while John only wanted radio-friendly work. Whatever the true reason, John was devastated by the news, and he fled to California to kind of figure out his next moves. He didn't ask Betsy to come with him, and she wouldn't have been able to anyway because of work. But besides that, she really didn't know how to help him. She was completely out of her depth, and she knew he had to do this on his own. But very soon after, still unsure of how they came to this decision, the pair agreed to divorce, and Betsy flew out to California to sign the papers. She stayed the night at his house. They drank wine, he lit candles, he even played the piano for her. They clearly still loved each other, and this final night they had together crushed her, because she knew she couldn't save him. The man she loved was still using, he wasn't ready to get clean, and no amount of love could get him clean. She couldn't live like that anymore, so she signed the papers and left the next day. Her mother actually responded to this news by sending her a box of homemade chocolate chip cookies, which is such an innocently sweet thing to do. But despite all the bad, Betsy still says that John Cale is her favorite ex-husband.
All of them were mistakes from the dress on down. Oh no, not for John in City Hall.
For years after their divorce, they didn't speak, but she did continue to follow his career, and eventually they would cross paths again. And she even attended the Grammys when he received his Lifetime Achievement Award for his work with the Velvet Underground. She attended because she was credited as being their fashion designer, which was a title she was proud of. And you can see in these photos that there was no animosity for how things ended. Just pure love, with Johnson saying, "I just felt like I had no time to dwell on that. Where would it get me? You can mourn something, but if you don't let go of it, you lose what you're supposed to be doing." And she really didn't have time to dwell, as in 1969, Paraphernalia had overexpanded, going the franchise route, and Betsy left. She didn't feel they were relevant anymore. This was the end of the 60s, and everything had gone wrong. Betsy had gotten divorced, Janis Joplin had died, Jimi Hendrix was dead, and when they finally made it to the moon, there was nothing of great significance there. It really truly felt like the 60s were over, and Betsy just decided to put that decade of her life behind her. So she applied for a few junior labels, but found that no one wanted to hire her because she had worked at Paraphernalia. They felt she was part of the drug scene, which was an unfair and rude assumption, but Betsy was crushed. No one truly wanted to hire her. And then 2 former Paraphernalia employees and friends of Betsy quit and decided that they were going to open up shop together. And that is how Betsy, Bunky, and Nini was born. Barbara Bunky Washburn, Betsey Johnson, and Anita Nina Latour opened up Betsy, Bunky, and Nini. With Bunky saying, Paraphernalia was a very crazy place to work. It was really hard to work with people who were out of it, so we decided we could figure out something on our own, which was silly, but it worked out. They opened Betsy, Bunky, and Nini in a brownstone on 53rd between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. Bunky was in charge of buying, Nini was in charge of the business side of things, and Betsy was responsible for turning out designs. She worked there day and night making samples, copying them in the sew room, and she had done a complete 180 from how she had designed at Paraphernalia, going back to her roots with prairie dresses and calico prints. She even revisited her obsession with petticoats with cowgirl vibes. And very quickly the shop became a destination for the hip uptown girls that didn't want to go downtown. Her designs were sold alongside the work of Ossie Clark and Kenzo. And in October 1969, the Chicago Tribune wrote, "The armholes of Miss Johnson's dresses were cut so deeply into the shoulder line that the dress never moved out of position when hands were raised straight over the head." She credited Charles James for helping her with this construction. And while the shop was gaining traction and making money, Betsy wasn't making nearly enough money to survive. And she needed to supplement her income, so she began looking for a full-time job elsewhere. But again, no one wanted to hire her, this time because she lacked the proper degrees for any high-paying position. But then something major happened. Anita Nini Latour's boyfriend Les was playing basketball at the Y with his friend Norman, and they got to talking like boys do, and Les told this guy Norman how Nini, Bunky, and Betsy had been unhappy at Paraphernalia and had decided to open their own boutique. Turns out this guy Norman was actually a sales director for the clothing company Alley Cat, and when he heard Betsy's name, his interest was piqued. His company had actually been looking for a new designer, and he felt Betsey Johnson would be the perfect fit. So he got her number, gave her a call, and she went in for an interview. Alley Cat was a label looking to go into the junior market and reach the then untapped teen market, which they felt had huge potential for growth. But they needed someone who could appeal to the younger crowd, and they felt Betsy was the perfect fit. And Betsy loved the potential that Alley Cat held. At Paraphernalia, she felt caged in by the small quantities produced and knew that mass production was a major step up. She could make affordable garments for a mass amount of people, but after Paraphernalia, she had a few stipulations. She wanted to be left alone. She wanted her name on the label to read Betsey Johnson for Alley Cat. She was going to continue working with Bunky and Nini at the boutique because she had made a commitment to them and she needed to honor it. Plus, she was more than capable of handling 2 jobs. She also wanted to be in charge of decorating the showrooms, and she wanted to hire and train the girls who would work in the showroom. And they gave her everything she wanted. Right off the bat, Betsy knew what she wanted to do, and that made the job easier on everyone. She surrounded herself with familiar objects she'd like to look at and draw, developing a new work process of sketching everything from cherries to dolls, all things that were going through her head. Even an Art Deco teapot she had that became a motif for a quilted coat. She even became interested in knits and making jacquard sweaters, so she learned how to draw a pattern on graph paper with each square representing a single stitch. A very tedious process that took knitters up to 2 weeks to complete, just so they could then be sent to the factories. She oversaw everything. She stayed in Philadelphia for the entire knitting process. She traveled to India to see the new fabrics being produced, and she even went to Turkey to purchase textiles. She was collecting those miles, and she had some pretty insane adventures along the way. Like after a trip to India on her way to London for work, her plane made an emergency landing in Yugoslavia, and everyone was forced to deboard. Outside, police and other vehicles were there waiting, and Betsy was the only person taken out of the group, put into the back of a van and driven off. She rode in complete silence until she was brought to a small clinic surrounded by high walls and armed guards, where they then put her in a hospital room, and then nothing. No one told her anything. After a few hours, a doctor came in with a needle, and that's when Betsy flipped out. She had no idea why she was there or what they were going to do to her, and it was like something out of a horror movie. Out of complete and rational fear, she ran away, out of the clinic, past the guards, and down the hill into a bus stop with a phone booth. After 10 minutes, they found her, brought her back to the clinic, where they finally explained that there had been a cholera epidemic in India for like the last decade, and Yugoslavia took heavy precautions by double-checking everyone coming in and out of the country. And at the airport in India, someone didn't check the right boxes on her paperwork, so her files were flagged, claiming that she didn't have the required shots, but she did. However, that mistake is why the plane was forced to land, and because it was a weekend, the clinic was closed and there had been no doctor on site, which is why she had to wait so long, and why they were trying to give her a shot. Betsy heard them out, relented to the shot, and stayed a couple days for precautionary reasons. But it just sounded absolutely crazy, and I can't figure out why no one told her anything from the beginning, because it sounds like an actual nightmare. Anyway, Betsy would make it out eventually, and she got back to work, Working at Alley Cat amplified her reputation. Her first year there, she brought in more than $5 million in sales, and her designs were so well received by the press. Patricia Fields, the stylist, said knitted sweaters and dresses. That's what I remember the most. Sweaters with cats knitted in and other imagery. They were tight to the body, tight in the sleeve, and they had a little poof in the shoulder. She was hot on fire. I had a very young clientele, and Betsy was one of the leading designers of the young girls. She was now 28 years old and desperate for financial security, so she asked Alley Cat for a 4-year contract, and they agreed. A year later, in 1971, she was awarded the coveted COTY Winnie Award, which is like the Oscars of fashion. And it is said that Diane von Furstenberg and Donna Karan were so upset by Betsey Johnson's win because they didn't see her as a real fashion designer, which is a bit outrageous if true, because she was literally defining the fashion of a generation of teenagers. But whatever. They were probably just jealous because she received the award alongside Halston. And she decided she wanted to look presentable and grown up, so to accept the award, she opted for a black velvet tuxedo suit with a big black velvet bow tie. And it was truly a night to remember. Halston brought out his Halstonettes, and to Betsy this felt like one of the final days of fashion as a truly independent expression of art, before a designer had to be friends with Anna Wintour or be signed to a conglomerate. But this was 1972. Corporatization of fashion wouldn't hit big until the 80s and 90s, but this does feel like the last true time period where one could create without inhibition. However, despite the success, by the end of Betsy's third year at Alley Cat, she realized the business was changing. The junior market was quickly evolving, trends had shifted to be more minimal, and it had provided opportunities for designers like Calvin Klein and Donna Karan to swoop in. Betsy really tried to mimic the minimal style. However, she just didn't have it in her. She hated it. She didn't want to fake it anymore, so she decided to leave Alley Cat.
Minimalism, I don't like minimalism.
You don't.
I like maximalism.
What are your thoughts on minimalism?
I don't know. I've just always liked the more is more is more is more. More petticoats, more everything. Everybody feels minimalistic. They want to put on one thing. That's it, and be comfortable. I mean, bottom line, be whatever, minimal or maximal. Just have a good time. Have a good time, darling.
Saying back in the 60s and 70s, there were trends which I really didn't follow. It was like petticoats and Little House on the Prairie dresses. But to me, any good trend doesn't last any longer than a marriage, and my longest marriage was 2.5 years. Alley Cat did last about 4 years, but they started telling me what to do, and I hated it. I had to pay money to get out of my contract, but I just couldn't stand it anymore, and I felt like I had lost my entire career. So Betsy was out of Alley Cat, and her involvement in Betsy, Bunky, and Nini was kind of over too, with Bunky saying her absence was really natural. She just drifted off as time went on. She had gotten busy doing freelance work in Hong Kong, and she was now spending upwards of 6 weeks at a time there. And while she hated traveling so much, she didn't have any children, and it was a lot easier to travel, but that would soon change with the introduction of Joe, or Clark Murray. See, this is where things get a little confusing. So in Betsy's autobiography, she wrote about dating a man named Joe in 1973 who made large metal sculptures, and he would end up being the father of her daughter Lulu. However, and here's where the conundrum lies, if you do even one Google search, it says everywhere that Clark Murray is Lulu Johnson's father, and he is also a metal sculptor. So I think she just changed his name for the sake of the story because he actually sucks. So this guy Joe and Clark Murray, I believe, are the same person. Not that it really matters, but I'm going to continue calling him Joe. So in 1973, Betsy began dating this man Joe, and their relationship moved quickly. It wasn't love, and as time went on, Betsy really became disenchanted by the relationship. She wanted out, she hated coming home to an apartment filled with metal scrapings everywhere, and she planned to leave him. But then she found out that she was pregnant, and everything changed. Nothing else mattered anymore to her. She was 33 years old, and she knew exactly what she wanted. Joe didn't. When she was about 7 to 8 months pregnant, her relationship with Joe blew up, and Betsy was done. She knew in her heart that he didn't want a baby and was merely holding on to her as a meal ticket. She had a secure job, she had a weekly paycheck, and she had money. And for the entirety of their relationship, she had paid all the bills and made sure the lights had stayed on. And that's why Joe had stayed. It wasn't love, and that isn't reason enough to stay with anyone. At first, Betsy had been having doubts about raising a child alone, but she got around to the idea very quickly. She knew that to be responsible and keep this baby safe, she needed to leave Joe. So right before the baby was born, she informed him that when she was strong enough, she was going to move out. Not leave with the baby and never let him see it, just move out. And Joe actually responded by threatening her, telling her that if she left, he would find her, break into her apartment, and take the baby. Now my heart sank when I heard this. This was all about control. He didn't care about the baby. He fully threatened to take the one thing she held dear from her out of spite. Then on April 7th, Betsy gave birth to her daughter Lulu, named after a character in a song her dad used to play for her on the piano, as well as a statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And I was a little confused by this too, but she said in her book that a friend had actually brought back a statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe from Mexico and had nicknamed her Lulu. And Betsy just loved the way the name sounded so much, so that is how her daughter Lulu was born. And from the moment she held her, she knew it was going to be them against the world. Joe actually showed up at the hospital, but not to see the baby. It was to inform Betsy that he was flying to Mexico for work, and then he left, never once holding his daughter. And Betsy, seeing this as her opportunity, went back to their apartment, packed up, and moved out after having just given birth. But when Joe came back, he literally stalked her to find where she was staying, and Betsy found him trying to scale the side of her third-floor apartment. So she got a restraining order taken out, and he left New York. Years later, she would receive a phone call from a woman claiming to be Joe's wife, demanding Betsy give her money to support her, Joe, and their 4 children. And to this, Betsy laughed, hung up the phone, and never heard from them again. All that guy ever cared about was money. And yeah, you can make the argument that Betsy shouldn't have left with his child without telling him. When you feel your baby wouldn't be safe, nothing else matters. Betsy even said, never ever be afraid to do something on your own. I felt being a single mom was the best thing that ever happened to me. Being alone or being a single mom is better than being in a bad relationship. Because Joe could have taken her to court and tried to get custody, but he didn't. He tried to scare Betsy, threatening her into staying with him, and in my eyes, good riddance. And Betsy really loved being a single mom. She took Lulu everywhere with her. She even nursed her in meetings with clients, which is pretty baller. Betsy never let Lulu slow her down. She never stopped working, and for around 4 years, she did a lot of freelance work for around 9 clients, until it stopped being fun for her. Despite having her name on multiple labels, it didn't feel right. She was tired of designing someone else's vision, so she moved on, expressing her concerns to friends who all encouraged her to go out on her own, to do it herself, design a collection, plan a show, and announce herself to the world. But that scared her, so for about a year she looked for a company to hire her that would let her design her own line, but no one wanted to hire her for that. No one wanted to fund her vision under their own label. And the more rejections she got, the more the thought of opening her own business excited her. So she started building a plan, and in 1978, the Betsey Johnson label was born. She brought in her friend and former model Chantel Bacon. Betsy knew her from London, and they always had a connection. Betsy knew Chantel was the best match for her, with Patricia Fields even saying, Betsy is an artist, a designer. She is not really a businesswoman. She's got generosity, a good heart, she is positive, happy, creative, and she was getting abused by these commercial companies. And then she met Chantel, and the two of them started from ground zero, and they built that business. Chantel was the perfect person for Betsy because she was the business person, the organizer. They were a match made in heaven, and together they made that a fantastic success. Betsy and Chantel tried on their own to gather the money needed to start the business, and while they did work hard trying to get an investment, Betsy soon realized she had the money. And it's actually such a funny Betsey Johnson story to tell. So years ago, Betsy actually did a commercial for Bayer for $10,000, and her parents had encouraged her to save the money. Either invest it or just save it, but don't spend it. So she did. And then one night at Max's Kansas City, she met a Wall Street guy who told her to invest her money in a new ladies' gynecological machine. And there at the club, she wrote him a $10,000 check and forgot all about it. 8 years later at a family dinner, her aunt was discussing stocks with her and told her how this one stock, Dynatech, was going through the roof. Betsy instantly recognized the name and realized that that was the company she had invested her money into 8 years earlier. so she sold her shares and used the money for her company. They could now start their business, and to mark this turning point in her life, Betsy cut off all her hair, dyed it black, and wore it spiky. A fresh new start to new beginnings, and this really did become another turning point in her career. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Betsey Johnson became connected to the icons of the time, including Andy Warhol, Twiggy, the Velvet Underground, Edie Sedgwick, and more. But after opening up her own shop, Betsey Johnson became a household name to icons like Cyndi Lauper, Diana Ross, and Debbie Harry. But neither Betsy nor Chantel were prepared for the level of success they would receive. But they never complained. In Chantel's own words, she said, "I had no idea what I was doing, and we just kind of jumped into it. She was the pattern maker, I was the fitting model, I did all the production and sales and everything, and we kind of learned as we went." The level of success they saw led them to opening over 100 retail locations, but it wasn't all easy. It never is, so let's get into it. For their first show, Betsy invited everyone she could think of, her contacts at Paraphernalia and Alley Cat, as well. Edie Locke shared a list of people for Mademoiselle, and the place was packed. Every seat was taken, and there was actually a line out the door of people hoping to get in. The entire collection was devoted to a new DuPont fabric she had found called cotton lycra. It had a 4-way or circular stretch, which allowed for the fabric to mold to the body with ease. It was very forgiving, and Betsy created a stretch wardrobe out of it that included leggings, skirts, t-shirts, and more. The entire collection was interchangeable, a mix and match heaven, and for the time period it made sense. Women could own multiple pieces, style them differently every time, and still look good. The fabric was breathable, washable, modular, and affordable, not to mention cheap in comparison to other fabrics. And it was relatively new to fashion, so no one else was really making anything with cotton lycra. The show was presented in a church with no proper runway, as they didn't have the money for that, nor did they have the money to hire legit models, so Betsy hired strippers from the garment district who worked during the day as fit models. She laid out the entire collection on the floor so that when the curtains came up, the girls would all be standing in a row wearing bodysuits or bikinis. They would then step off the stage into the pit where the clothes were, and then they would dress themselves, swapping pieces right there in front of the audience, like a bunch of girls just trying on clothes together. There were wrap dresses, jackets, crop tops, bikinis, leggings, tight bodycon dresses, all in black and white, red and white, or all black. A very punk rock color palette, and it was unlike anything happening at the time. It was activewear meets streetwear. Now, everyone came back to look at the collection, and everyone was saying, "Betsy is back," but there were no sales. No one bought anything. But then 3 weeks later, Elio Fiorucci and his people stopped by to see the collection, and they loved it. They placed a very large order and launched it at a party they were having at their boutique. And Betsy, being a little overeager, decided this interest meant that she needed to get started on her next collection, expanding on what people liked about the collection and taking out what they didn't like. However, the whole thing was a failure. She was in a rut. Nothing seemed to be working out. People on the street were constantly stopping her and asking her where she had bought her clothes, but no buyers wanted to put anything in their stores. And then one day, she ran into an old friend, Annie Flanders, style editor of Soho Weekly News and Details magazine, who told Betsy the only logical thing to do would be to open a storefront. And it made sense. She had the demand from people, just not buyers. And this way she could sell what she wanted. There was no one above her, no one she had to depend on. Annie even helped her find a location in Soho just before Soho became Soho. Betsy, Chantel, and their team worked day and night getting the store stocked. Annie, being a writer for the Soho Weekly News, even decided to write a feature on the storefront, and it was perfect timing, because as the store was set to open, the New York Times writers had gone on strike, so the Soho Weekly News got a placement in newsstands all over the city. Turnout was insane, and the business quickly picked up. Her friend Kim Hashreiter, who worked at Betsy, Bunky, and Nini, said, "She wasn't who the fashion world likes to pick, like trendy people. They want someone that's hot at this moment, either really rich or someone that's really connected. She just didn't fit in anywhere. She started to open stores, which was the smartest idea because then it was like Betsy's world."
She loved me, Diana Vreeland. I ran into her in the elevator and she said to me, she said, "My dear, you simply look extremely amusing." That was it. And I'm like, "Oh, thank you. I'm going to fall down and die now." because she created Vogue. She was a true diva of very supportive Diana, but not Vogue, pre-Anna Wintour, who did not love me because I didn't go to Parsons and I didn't promote fashion the way she saw fashion. I didn't play by the rules. I had kids over my house from the design schools and I was teaching them. I always made my own patterns. I always sewed my clothes. My mother taught me how to sew. Vogue, I think I got in my whole life, Christy Turlington wearing one of my cutest little gingham, little black and white gingham. I got 2 pages in Vogue. I basically think that's me.
That's you.
And who is the one in the silver?
That's Anna Wintour.
I was never that close to Anna in my life. I got 4 pages on Christy Turlington in my checkerboard little gingham. And who's that?
That's Christy too. It's all 3 from the same shoot in Vogue.
Me, Vogue?
Wearing you,
You were kidding. I didn't think Vogue shot my clothes that much. I was more Mademoiselle. I was more bizarre. I just never felt worthy.
And within 6 months, they had outgrown their tiny space and had to relocate. Despite business being great, Betsy and the team lived on nothing. All the money went back into the shop. Betsy and Chantel only made enough money to pay rent, otherwise they were surviving off cans of tuna. But they were making their dreams come true. They believed in what they were doing and were willing to do anything to see it through. From here on, Betsey Johnson would show a collection twice a year, and from 1981 onwards, she would conclude every show with a cartwheel down the runway. A move that would become a part of her image and brand, a subversion from the standard practice of the industry, a simple wave, nod, or walk. Betsy was doing things differently, shaking up the fashion world and having a blast doing so, and the customers were equally thrilled. Cyndi Lauper even said, "On my very first trip to Europe as a singer-writer for Blue Angel, I bought a Betsey Johnson hot pink sweater with zippers all along the front of it. It was pink punk, and it was an affordable, fashionable sweater I could wear as a rocker on my first rock and roll tour in Europe. I never forgot the way that sweater made me feel." Betsy helped even middle America get a little funky and sexy. Her pretty meets punk style fit into the punk and new wave scenes of the decade. As well, Diana Ross loved Betsey Johnson, with Chantel saying that when Bergdorf's gave them window display space at their store in New York, Diana Ross and her band went and bought everything off the mannequins. Just an incredible and wide range of celebrity clients who found her work enjoyable and wearable. And that's the thing, celebrities just bought her work. Betsy never went out and begged people to wear her work or paid anyone to wear Betsey Johnson. She never did that. Anyone who wore Betsey Johnson wore it because they wanted to. Despite the heavy workload that came with their success and being a full-time single mother, Betsy still had time for love. Or, well, her perceived notion of what love is. Not long after opening the shop, she got into a routine, and every day she would go and get coffee from a cafe down the street. And that is where she met Jeff, a guy who worked behind the counter, and at first they casually flirted as one does, but then eventually they started dating. It was lightweight and superficial, as Betsy recalls, a vacation boyfriend, adorable, but they had nothing to talk about. However, before she knew it, he was moving in with her, and Lulu absolutely hated the guy, with Betsy saying Lulu always had a gift for spotting a fake, a gene she said she lacked. Because Jeff was horrible. One night he came home drunk, stumbled into something in her apartment, and in a fit of rage he started throwing things and breaking things. Lulu woke up terrified, and Betsy, not missing a beat, grabbed Lulu, hailed a cab, and went to a friend's house. Jeff called her the next day apologizing, promising it would never happen again, and Betsy forgave him. Lulu never did. And shockingly, or not so shockingly, this would happen again, and like a routine, he was prone to these fits of rage, and Betsy would leave him and eventually take him back. But then after one of these fights, Jeff asked Betsy to marry him, and with no idea as to why, she said yes. Years later, she said that she believed she said yes because she had marriage on the brain. She had been designing a wedding collection, and getting married fit into her storyline. Jeff just happened to be the guy around, and she had the big white wedding with each bridesmaid wearing a different dress from her bridal collection. At the reception, it was clear to everyone that Jeff was high out of his mind, but Betsy was too caught up in the party to notice or care. She now knows that no one believed in their marriage, not even her. She mostly cared about their honeymoon, but even that was ruined by Jeff, who spent the entire flight going through withdrawals, and Betsy spent the first few days of their honeymoon looking for pain pills for him. Eventually she found some, but she had had enough. She was done, and she told him as much. So Jeff left, and Betsy stayed to finish her vacation. When she arrived home, she found Jeff and all of his belongings gone. And she immediately started filing for divorce, but Jeff got the jump on her. And he tried suing her for damages, believing he was entitled to half of her money and assets, even though they hadn't even been married a week. Eventually the suit fell through, and Betsy washed her hands of Jeff.
The one wedding, I can't even remember what I wore. I can't even remember the husband, basically, either. I ever wear a bridal gown? Yes. No, it was spandex. And the sleeves were so puffy and big that to hold them up, I had balloons inside. And when we got to the altar and I said I do, I popped my balloons. It was very funny. But that was bad. I was a meet the guy, marry the guy, and divorce the guy within 3 months.
She refocused her attention on work and expansion. They would open a second store on the Upper West Side, then another in Melrose, and a year later they opened a store in Boston and then one in Florida. And within a few years they had around 20 retail locations, and it made sense. By the 80s and 90s, she was showing at every New York fashion event, and rock stars like Debbie Harry and the B-52s were devoted Betsey Johnson clients. Her work was everywhere. She was inviting women into the wacky and fashionable world of Betsey Johnson, giving them the power to take back control. Her popularity in the 80s and 90s and 2000s was just as powerful as her success and hold on fashion in the 60s and 70s.
Fuck the clothes. The older my shows are, the more I love them because they're so raw, they're so pure, they're so sexy, they're so unsaleable. They were saleable. We stayed in business making clothes like this. When I look at my early shows, they are so simple and skin tight, little slip dresses, very bare, very raw, very transparent, but they establish me right off the bat because I didn't compromise. I didn't care. I was the first person to put her on the runway. We have to fly her in from New York, and that was the beginning of Adriana. A lot of models got their start on my runway because I'd say, do your own thing, go out there and dance and be sexy and be yourself. Do anything you want on the runway. Then they started getting jobs to be sexy and to do anything you want because otherwise they were told to be models, had to go by the rules of what modeling was about in those days. So my shows were popular because I let people be totally expressive. I just say, follow the music, go with the music, and you got it. I look at my old stuff and go, holy fuck, I was really fucking good. Because in those days, you're dealing with, well, Anna Wintour never came to a show. These girls made my shows. That's, I think, what I invented. Most couture people made the people show the clothes. I made the girls show the girls because I let my girls be them on the runway. It gave Victoria's Secret and other runway throwing show people the idea that it's great to let your girls be them. That is who I introduced on the runway. Adriana Lean, Line, Victoria's Secret's queen. That's Adriana, yep.
And Giselle.
That's Giselle. Yes, it is. In the old days, these girls were not super model stars yet. These are my girls.
Do you remember this show?
Seven Sisters. The only time in my life I worked with a stylist on a show, and his name is Bill Mullen. And he came up with the idea of Seven Sisters and the whole story. It was all over the place. It was very Victoriana. Like this outfit is very Norwegian-esque Fair Isle looking. This was very corsety, this is not as interesting though. No, that's just one of my favorite shows. I love looking at my old shows because I had so many ideas that I could have made an entire show on one idea.
It's anti-fashion. It's kind of all mixed up.
I was probably one of the weirdest show throwers of the day. That's a dress made out of my hair extensions. I was on a roll and I was young. It was great. I look at my old stuff and go, holy fuck, I was really fucking good.
By spring 1994, Betsy was already cartwheeling, kicking, and doing the splits down the runway, but it was at this show she cartwheeled in a skirt made entirely out of hair extensions, a personal favorite moment of hers that embraced the kitschy femininity she loved. With Betsy saying it was kind of lingerie, the puff sleeves, the bussy push-up bras, very sexy and exactly what I do now and what I've done for 30 years. Midway through the show, one model dropped a bright pink box full of shoes on the runway, and Betsy came out, threw a few pairs into the audience before a duo of models came through and pretended to sweep them up. And then in her fall 1996 collection, she went full-on goth and punk. With plaids, floral sheer prints, and paisleys, she used mesh and velvets with deep rich tones, sheer mesh tops, cheetah prints, double-belted waistlines with plunging V-neck gowns, plaid miniskirts, long skirts, layered outfits with chains and statement grommet belts, as well Tom Ford-esque faux fur bright colored jackets, and Loewe Jonathan Anderson-style sunglasses. By spring 1997, she was debuting pretty pastels with soft and whimsical details, yet strong and fitted silhouettes. The layered looks with striking corsets and dainty bows are just gorgeous. She actually remade this white bow dress for a collaboration with Urban Outfitters in like 2019, and my sister actually owns this dress and I own the pink one. And those butterfly headbands were remade in purple for Olivia Rodrigo to wear to the Met Gala in 2021. Then in her fall 1997 collection, she took on futuristic goth themes with warm amber and burgundy tones, as well as sharp silvery pieces. Deborah Shaw walked out in an off-the-shoulder silver top accessorized with a giant cross chain necklace, matching grommet belt, silver gloves, holding a pair of giant grapes in her hands, while wearing a silver Viking horn hat. There were other variations of this silver material in the form of mini dresses, boots, matrix-style coats, and gowns. Other models wore bright orangey red strapless scrunched dresses with tiaras and bows at the neck with matching colored tights. There were paisley printed off-the-shoulder dresses with fur trims, grungy prom dresses, some of which were shimmery and see-through, peaked shoulder leather jackets with matching miniskirts, burgundy lace trim dresses with matching lace cover-ups, bondage wrap dresses, and lace bodysuits. Her vibes give me the same vibes as the iconic Anna Suisse grunge collection, and I just love it so much. Betsey Johnson was on a roll. By the 90s and 2000s, she was the talk of the town, and with her success came travel, and with travel came Betsey Johnson's third husband. And here is again where things get a little confusing. Because in her autobiography, Betsy does not give the name of her third husband. Because as you will soon find out, he was a literal horrible being. Definitely not human or a man by any standards. And it's windy over here. And I'm pretty sure you can Google his name, but there isn't any information out there about him outside of what she writes. So it's like he evaporated. I don't even know what he looks like because there are no pictures of him online. And if you Google him, you just get pictures of Betsey Johnson and John Cale at the Grammys. So I don't know. And it also says everywhere that she is still married to this man, which isn't true. I also don't think she's married now because I remember her talking about dating and falling in love just recently. So take from this what you will. I don't know if any of it truly matters, but I'm putting it out there for you to decide. Anyway, her third husband doesn't exist, and for good reason. He probably changed his name, but he should be ashamed of who he is, disgusted by himself. And for the sake of the video, I won't even mention his name. We're just going to refer to him as husband number 3. And here is where I really want to put a disclaimer or trigger warning, because I will be talking about a very abusive relationship, mentally, physically, psychologically. There's also some brief moments of assault and talk of weight. So if these are things you aren't good with, no worries. I'm not really good with them either, but I will put a timestamp if you do want to skip over this. I totally understand. It is awful. Okay, now that that's settled, Betsy describes her third husband as beautiful, British looking, and a world-class wine collector who worked in emerging technologies. Very rich, the kind of rich that gives you a lot of free time, and it doesn't seem like a match made in heaven considering all Betsey Johnson ever did was work. But that didn't stop him from begging her to leave work to spend time with him. And Betsy would soon find the time to fly every other weekend to one of his homes in Palo Alto, Jamaica, or Yorkshire. She was living a completely different life, opposite the one she had imagined for herself, very jet set and overwhelmed by his love bombing. Whenever she arrived at one of his houses, he would fill it with fresh flowers and shower her with gifts including jewelry, diamonds, and a vintage car. But like I said, scum of the earth. Once on a trip to Jamaica, they went to dinner at a 5-star restaurant where Ralph Lauren also happened to be dining. Now, soon-to-be husband number 3 insisted on dining barefoot, despite the restaurant refusing him service because why wouldn't you be wearing shoes? That's disgusting. Anyway, husband number 3 threw a fit inside the restaurant and Ralph Lauren watched the entire thing. While Betsy stood there mortified, his entitlement and childish behavior left her embarrassed. But it also scared her. Another time, he decided to buy a 4-seater plane for his home in Yorkshire and decided that Betsy should accompany him on a test run. And here is truly where the nightmare begins. Once they got in the air, he told the pilot to cut the engines, and Betsy wigged out. She begged him to turn them back on, pleaded to be let off this plane, and the entire time she is crying, screaming, and pleading for her life. And husband number 3 is just sitting there laughing. He laughed and laughed and laughed. After a few minutes, they turned the engines back on and landed the plane. When she got out, her legs were useless, her throat was raw from screaming, and husband number 3 was still laughing. He later informed her that they were never in any real danger, as part of the test required them to test fly the plane on each engine individually, and this man told the pilot not to tell Betsy anything, no matter how freaked out she got. To him, it was all a joke. Betsy thought she was going to die, and he sat there laughing, never once consoling her, never once breaking character. Just so freaking cruel. And it gets so much worse. In Palo Alto, husband number 3 lived down the street from his ex-wife and 2 children, and for some reason this ex-wife was always at his home and would very loudly make comments about Betsy's weight and criticize everything she ate. Husband number 3 found it funny when his ex made these comments about Betsy's weight, as he was just as vocal and criticizing of her weight. In fact, he would make her weigh in every time she visited him. So like every weekend, this man would make her step on a scale and demand she keep her weight at a level he found attractive for her own good. That makes me want to throw up. Okay. Obviously, he was very controlling, wanting to micromanage her life. He would even dictate what weekends she would visit, and it didn't matter if she were busy. If he wanted her to be there, she had to be there. Eventually, everything including her work took a backseat. Their relationship lasted on and off about 8 years, and during a very bad period, she briefly found solace in an old friend she had a crush on. He was sweet to her, something she hadn't experienced for a long time, so she invited him back to her place and they talked about her relationship, how she was feeling, and one thing led to another and they shared a kiss. It was refreshing, it was kind, but the good times quickly ended when in the middle of this little makeout session, husband number 3 called her, accusing her of having a guy in her apartment and cheating on him. And she got spooked. She didn't understand how he knew, but it really freaked her out, like he was listening or something. And I want us not to forget this moment because I will be circling back to it very soon. Betsy found it really hard to leave him. He belittled her, he controlled her, he threatened her. She feared him. They had a lot of ups and downs in their relationships, but those good times, though they were few, are what she held on to. Once during a very rare good period, they were in Yorkshire during the winter, and it made her nostalgic for her childhood winters in Connecticut. She was feeling nostalgic, young, she was taking it all in, and then husband number 3 told her how they wouldn't be able to visit Yorkshire again until August. And that hurt a little because in that moment she felt peace. And out of nowhere she said, "Hey, that's my birthday. Why don't we get married?" And he said yes. Things had been good between them. She was filled with nostalgia from her childhood, and she just wanted to be loved. She just wanted to be loved. They would get married in Yorkshire 7 months later, surrounded by wildflowers, and she was so focused on planning the wedding and the excitement of it all that the reality of what she was getting herself into didn't fully hit her until she was walking down the aisle. And by that point, she felt it was too late, recalling it hitting her like a tidal wave. Her stomach was full of knots. Her whole family had just flown in for this wedding, and she felt the show must go on. And so it did. But literally right after they got married, Betsy overheard husband number 3 talking very loudly and publicly to his buddies about how he really needed to consummate this marriage. And then started grabbing at her. And she tried pulling away, telling him her whole family was there and she would not be leaving her own wedding to have sex. He was furious, insisting that he needed to possess her. He literally dragged her up to a room, tried ripping off her dress, and after her constant refusals, he tried ripping the wedding ring off of her finger. He almost broke her fingers in the process, and when he finally got the ring off, he threw it across the room and stormed out. So many of her friends tried to get her to see how awful he was, but she just wasn't ready. And Lulu wanted no part of this. Not only was she against the marriage, but their entire relationship. She hated him. She resented how he treated her mother, and Lulu and Betsy would actually get into fights about him. Betsy knew it was an awful position to put her daughter into, but again, this was an abusive relationship. It's not easy to walk away from something like this. But thankfully, after 6 months of marriage, Betsy, for no particular reason, was tired. She didn't have it in her anymore to care. She felt like it was time to leave. On a Thursday, she was scheduled to go to Jamaica to visit him. She didn't get on the plane. He was immediately informed and he called her non-stop, call after call, message after message, each one more and more threatening. At one point, he told her he was going to fly to New York and bring her to Jamaica himself. Lulu stayed with her throughout the entire ordeal, but the threats just got so much scarier that they decided to stay in a hotel and hide there for 2 days. After that, he left one final message telling her that she had won and that he was headed to Haiti to sign divorce papers. It was finally over.
What is the biggest mistake a bride can wear? You've had a few weddings.
All of them were mistakes from the dress on down.
And do you remember when I mentioned about Betsy and that guy kissing in her apartment and how she felt like he was listening to her? Well, after they got divorced, husband number 3 informed her that shortly after they began dating, he had arranged for her entire apartment to be bugged. He sent a team to her apartment to have cameras and listening devices installed. And that actually broke my heart. I am still ill over that. Like, it took my breath away the first time I read that. And it still freaks me out. He watched her, he stalked her, he controlled her. She never had any peace or privacy. He made sure to take all of that away from her. After they divorced, Betsy put that animal to the back of her mind, and it wasn't until 20 years later that she was finally able to take the wedding ring and have it melted down and sold for scraps, which was all that man was ever worth. And as if life wasn't hard enough on her, in 2001, Betsy woke up to find one of her breast implants had deflated. She had had them around 10 years at this point, and she was over them. So she called the doctor to have them removed, and during the healing process, she discovered a hard lump the size of a pea. The doctors removed it for testing, and that is how they discovered she had breast cancer. And when she told Lulu, she just broke down. She couldn't face the cancer, so she worked through 6 months of radiation treatments without telling anyone else. After her treatment, Betsy went into remission, and by coincidence or fate, she was asked by the CFDA to decorate a car to be auctioned off at the General Motors annual breast cancer awareness campaign. Betsy was shocked they had asked her because no one knew about her diagnosis besides Lulu. It was purely by chance they had asked her, and Betsy felt like this was the perfect time to share her secret with the world. An hour before the event, she told her entire staff the news and was glad she had waited to tell them, because between the crying and sad faces, she knew she wouldn't have been able to face them every day if they had known. And at the event, her speech about the impacts of implants and not being able to detect cancer in time and her journey to remission brought the room to tears. And it was then that it hit her. She had gone through a life-altering event, and by downplaying her cancer, she was able to get through her treatments. But it had blinded her to the enormity of the situation. And after going into remission and telling her story, she felt light. She felt like she could breathe again.
I'm a breast cancer survivor of 22 years. Out of the blue, surprise, surprise. In my time zone of breast cancer, nobody came out and talked about it. I think Carolina Herrera might have had it, but it was a no-no to talk about it. I couldn't tell myself. The acknowledgement that you have breast cancer is on you every second. So I had to go it alone, and that was very depressing. I told my daughter Lulu, and Lulu had to promise me she would never tell anyone else. I had my shit to do. Oh, I was doing fashion shows. I was designing. I was in the prime of life. I kept it a secret until you're ready to talk about it, and then talk about it big time.
She was proud of her journey thus far and the support and love she had received from her staff. So in fall 2002, she did something kind of unusual and loving for her staff, and she had 22 members walk down the runway, and the show was a hit. By this point in the 2000s, a Betsey Johnson dress was a rite of passage for many young teenagers. She was selling Teenage Rebellion and filling school gyms with her neon-trimmed hot pink dresses. And she was doing all of this without the frills and thrills of high fashion. By the mid-90s, Betsey Johnson was seeing around $150 million in sales. They hadn't borrowed any money, nor did they have investors. And by 2005, Betsy and Chantel found themselves co-owners of one of the largest privately owned companies. Everything was run by them. They had around 66 retail locations, and they were thriving. Until everything changed. A company from Boston, Castanea Partners, reached out with interest in buying into the company to help with expansion and to make Betsey Johnson more successful. At first, Betsy turned them down, but then Chantel confessed to her that she didn't know how much longer she wanted to work. When they had started in 1978, Chantel was under the impression it would be like a 10-year run. But it was now close to 30 years, with her saying, we had been doing it for 35 years, 30 years, it just felt time to change. I just didn't want to do it anymore. I wanted to experience something else. Betsy and Chantel had worked over 30 years making a company with 400 employees, and Chantel was tired. So Betsy agreed to sign over half the company, and that way they could still be on board but could finally have some help. And these changes happened instantly. Castanea Partners made her fire girls who had been there forever with people who knew nothing about fashion, but knew everything about money and expansion. A complete nightmare, but that's the way fashion was moving in the 90s and 2000s, and even today. It's all about money and expansion. These were finance people, and they criticized everything Betsy and Chantel had done and how they had operated their business. But they had been in business for 30 years by this point, and they clearly didn't need any help. They were obviously doing something right. But their team's attitude was, we know better than you. And Betsy said it had felt like everyone hired by Castanea was too busy preparing for meetings and never actually available to help with things that needed to be done. Betsy felt beaten down. She tried to focus on work, but she wanted to leave. Her work was now being judged by people she didn't respect and who made her feel insecure. They wanted her to be more trendy. But that wasn't who she was. That's literally the opposite of who she was. Like, the reason she opened her business was because she didn't want to follow trends. By 2007, the stores were struggling, the recession was hitting, and the company began to lose money. Chantel tried to tough it out, but eventually she would go on vacation and just never come back. Castanea tried to force her back. They tried to convince Betsy to bring her back, but Betsy knew it was over. She knew it was over for Chantel, and it was over in general. She could never replace Chantel, and she never would try to. Soon after, the suits told her they planned to file for bankruptcy and close all Betsey Johnson retail locations. And it seems like they didn't know what the hell they were doing. In August 2010, Steve Madden came into the fold and they bought her brand. And if he hadn't stepped in, her brand would cease to exist today. He kept it alive with her as creative director, working with licenses and with designers on a range of products. Around the same time, Lulu informed Betsy that she wanted to move to California with her 2 daughters. So Betsy left New York, bought a mobile home in California, and left New York behind. During the height of the pandemic, Betsy spent her downtime replicating her looks from the 80s, and she decided to pick up her sewing machine and relearn how to rethread it. In 2020, she was furloughed by Steve Madden, but she still continues to work, so I'm not exactly sure what's going on. But mark my words, Betsey Johnson will have her resurgence. She speaks to women, she knows women, she understands us, and the joy and happiness you feel when you wear a Betsey Johnson dress is indescribable. In November 2021, she listed her Malibu home, saying, "A couple days ago I felt I will never feel right. I will never get back the real me. I will never look that good again. I will never have that energy again. It's gone. I am 76. It is over. But every day I feel better and better and better, and I am getting closer to realizing that I can be that person again, that I don't need to throw in the towel." And she didn't. After listing her home, she moved to London, a place more beautiful and less boring than Malibu. And it was London where she created her beauty line Love Betsy for Walmart, with everything being sold for under $15. And this was a project she was very passionate about ever since she started dancing as a child. But in her small town, no one really wore makeup or dyed their hair, so it took her a long time until she felt comfortable being the outsider. Makeup became her form of expression, and by the 60s, with Twiggy, it had exploded. Bizarre makeup became approachable to everyday women. But Betsy is no stranger to anything bizarre, nor is she a stranger to London. By the late 60s and early 70s, she would visit a salon in London to get her colorful hair extensions put in. Like Rod Stewart, it felt very rock and roll to her, and so she stuck with it. She hated her thin, wavy hair and much preferred the fake plastic hair pieces. Unfortunately, they only last about 3 to 4 months before they need to be replaced, but these extensions became her look, her signature, how people recognized her. She loved the imperfect look of it and couldn't let it go, saying, "It's a discovery of who you are and what you want to look like, and then it becomes who you do look like because you become it, or it becomes you and it feels right." She still gets them done all the time. A 2-day process, 4 to 5 hours every day in London, and she still does it. Besides makeup and hair extensions, she has a growing list of celebrity admirers like Miley Cyrus, Olivia Rodrigo, Blue Ivy Carter. Lana Del Rey wore her diva boots to her 2023 Outside Land Festival set. Blue Ivy Carter wore her boots on stage with her mom during the Renaissance tour. And Olivia Rodrigo has worn Betsey Johnson to many events, with Betsy actually saying Olivia Rodrigo is a rebel and always has a hint of glamour, which is the essential Betsy girl. She is definitely the poster child of a brand. She wore her butterfly clips to the Met Gala in 2021 and her pieces in her music videos and on tour. In 2022, Betsey Johnson partnered with Miley Cyrus's Happy Hippie Foundation, whose efforts focused on supporting young LGBTQ people in need. And it truly was a special moment for Miley Cyrus, who wore a Betsey Johnson dress to her prom. And I love that so much because I love Miley Cyrus and I love Betsey Johnson, and her work is also very near and dear to my heart as well. She used to have a store in the Water Tower, and when I was a kid, I remember my mom would let me walk through there as long as I wanted. We didn't really have any money, but my mom and I would look through the racks at the dresses, and I would just imagine myself wearing them one day. And those are just very special memories for me. But besides her celebrity cachet, Betsey Johnson has collaborated with NYX, making cute kitschy underwear, as well as a collaboration with Torrid in October 2020, taking her designs and creating a truly size-inclusive collection. Besides all that, Betsey Johnson is fighting to get back the magic of her work. In 2008, she sold off her archives for $50 a piece, and now, like Anna Sui, she is trying to buy them back, paying upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars for work she made decades prior. Her work has a large market of buyers because it withstands the test of time. I even have one of her dresses from Paraphernalia, and It's incredible. She made what she loved, and that's what makes Betsey Johnson Betsey Johnson. With Todd Oldham saying she is in her own stratosphere, making beautiful objects of desire. Cool girls took her work and amplified her cachet.
Cher used to come to the showroom and she would buy the entire collection. And of course we gave Cher whatever she wanted.
She's an icon.
Wholesale. She's an icon.
Who was your dream celebrity to dress?
I love Twiggy because she was like a little girl of free spirit, just like a wide-eyed in 1964. I love Penelope Tree. I loved Angelica Houston. It's not just dressing them, it's meeting them, hanging out with them. The idea that they wanted to be dressed by me. There had to be a real connection. I can't get down to favorites because they're all my favorites.
You had girls of every generation.
I did. Every generation, every ilky dilky.
Betsey Johnson has lived so many lives. She has touched multiple generations of women and has spoken to them through her clothes at Paraphernalia in the 60s, at Alley Cat in the 70s, at Betsy, Bunky, and Nini, and even in her own stores.
At the Betsey Johnson show in the purple tent, and I found it. The Bell Rabbit from Metro Mini, the item for 2007.
She is truly a woman ahead of her time. It's hard to find a woman who doesn't have some sort of memory or connection to Betsey Johnson, and that's because she makes you feel brave. Her dresses make you feel like you're reliving your childhood again. The love of dressing up in fun colors and wacky trimmings and stomping around in your mismatched boots. She is beloved. Her repertoire may seem limited, but her reach is widespread, and it's a huge reason for her continuous success. With Johnson saying, "I just did what I believed in, and I luckily made it happen on my own." Be independent. Don't care about trends. When you're ready, do it. So this, I think, is where I'm going to end the video. I hope you enjoyed it and that this video makes you want to check out Betsey Johnson. She has definitely lived an interesting life, to say the least, and she's not slowing down. She worked making baby clothes, she had a reality TV show, she had open heart surgery, she was on Dancing with the Stars, she was in a sorority. Her last couple birthdays have been like drag performances.
I'm fucking 80, no way! I'm fucking 81. Yeah, 81, never looked so fucking bad.
So many things have happened to her, and she's never let anything get her down. And I love that for her.
Oh my, that's not me. Is that person me? I know the red plaid, the Stuart red plaid. That is me. Wait, where are my glasses? Oh, smoking a cigarette. That's me. That's definitely me. Oh my God, with the champagne. Well, I don't smoke now, but if anyone's got a vape around, I definitely have a vape. That's me. That's Amy Winehouse before she grew her hair long.
But that is all I have for you today, and I hope to see you all again soon. Bye.
You know, when I look back at it all, I was pretty fucking good. I had a good time, but I can't remember half of it.